Hello, everyone. This is Kurt Doolittle for the Proprietarian Institute of Natural Law. Let's take this moment to remind you that that when I'm using that term, I mean natural law, like natural philosophy means science, and like laws of nature. So, and then I have to distinguish between juridical law and law proper, which is the natural science of law and the whatever ends up being in jurisprudence. So, in my view, of course, natural law is just the top level of the sciences because it has the greatest scope of decidability across all subject matters. So, in any event, I think that's what it is. So, just in case you are new, that's my version of it. This is law proper, like laws of nature. Anyway, I'm sorry, what I'd like to know is from anyone who's watching, if the sound problem is fixed, because if it's not fixed, I don't know what the hell's going on. I've been using the same exact setup as one of these blue, whatever they are, microphones. My MacBook Pro, I'm recording directly into the studio and, directly into YouTube Live. And all I've got hooked up in here is the external monitor and hard drive. So if it's not working, I'm going to have to figure out what's causing that. So if you guys, so it sounds good to you, the rest of you confirm that I'm no longer skipping along? Yeah? Okay, great. Well, so today's topic is something near and dear to the manosphere, or the guys that are most of our followers are guys, of course, because anybody who studies this kind of subject matter or is even vaguely interested in it is going to have a certain set of proper personality traits. I include intelligence and personality traits. You can have a fairly high intelligence. You're going to have high systematizing over empathizing, which means your truth before face as truth, and you're going to have high disagreeableness or low agreeableness, meaning you have lower need to be able to fit into the crowd or suffer falsehoods, and so that's where truth before face comes in. So that's the importance of our method, is you have to have the ability to grasp it. You have to have a natural bias to see truth over the herd, and you have to have a natural bias towards tolerating the truth, even if it's unpleasant. So I'm going to repeat that sort of thing. Of course, the subject matter is going to be somewhat important. I'm a little thrown off because having this sound problem interrupted my flow, so it might take me a minute to get back into it. Anyway, so the subjects I want to cover, I put out there, which are really, I've only been working on, this is only the second or third week I've worked on the manosphere problem, or what we consider the dating market. And unlike religion, which was really, really hard, or truth, which was pretty hard, or testimony, which was pretty hard, it actually is or even the female method of conflict and warfare and the Jewish implementation of the female method of conflict and warfare against our institutions of cultural production. I mean, and the capture of our institutions, just like the Christians captured the institutions of the ancient world using the same method, using women by the same method, and the underclass by the same method. Well, whether it was underclass today is immigrants, and the underclass today was slaves and immigrants, and people who hadn't yet been Romanized. So we're seeing the repeat of it. But the manosphere in context is just pretty simple, really. In other words, the problem between male and female dating is pretty simple when you look at it as just one of the consequences of the failure to equally suppress female antisocial and military internal conflict generation warfare against institutions of cultural production, just like male antisocial behavior has been suppressed against physical access and physical assets and the physical means of economic and political production. So females, being social super predators, are excellent at social and informational warfare. They don't have to think about it. It's just genetic. And males are super predators against physical and economic and political assets. And so, we're really good at what we evolved to do, and the division of labor. And all we have to understand, which anybody who's and at all interested in the subject matter, is that from an evolutionary perspective, the audio and video is not synced. Is anyone else seeing that? And if not, I'll just complete my thought here. I'll complete my thought here in that how we became cooperative. In other words, how the sexes developed cooperation and how we developed neoteny was the suppression of alphas, and the suppression of alphas was females rallying males through social, sexual, and other incentives, basically nagging and undermining, gossiping, shaming, rallying, undermining. Females rallied the non-alpha males against the alpha males, and this produced the suppression of that, which of alpha male dominance, and redistributed reproduction to more and more people. Okay, so we're going to keep going if the sound issues. So I mean, this is not complicated. I think the only thing I want to tie it back to, so that everybody has a grasp that this isn't arbitrary, is that evolutionary computation, like all computation, in other words, all of the evolution of the universe from distributions in the quantum pressures in the common quantum foam, all the way up through the first protoparticles, the particles, the elements, the molecules, the biomolecules, the development of cellular life, and all of this is dependent on a competition between two extremes, increasing the amount of energy in other words, the scope of energy opportunity they can capture. And male and female is just like male and female is just a radical increase in the specialization, which increases the amount of evolutionary computation. So we tend to attribute some optimum. In other words, when we're looking back, Ian, I'm not in your head, makes my, yeah. So when we look back at history, we tend to project into evolutionary history something that isn't there. All that's there is evolutionary computation. That's it. There's nothing else there. So you can always reduce every behavior into evolutionary computation. That's where the universe is trying, I'm anthropomorphizing it a little bit, but the universe is trying or discovering ways of capturing more energy into a stable state and transferring it across time. That's it. That's all that's going on, even between us and women, and even between civilizations. So it's a really simple algorithm that builds the entire universe. There's nothing complex about it. And male and female relations are just that. Our second problem is we tend to project the present. We tend to project our understanding of the past into the present. But just as we went from hunter-gatherers and a very odd concept of the family by what we would consider today, to the agrarian period, and agrarianism allowed capital formation and property and intergenerational transfer of it, but it also made your work, the productivity of your work, more dependent upon you and your family. So the idea of the family, and the intergenerational family in particular, was a part of the agrarian age. And we're out of the agrarian age. Those incentives, and therefore the norms, traditions, values, social, economic, political, and military structures that we look back in the past for reference don't apply. they just don't apply anymore because the incentives have changed. However, the relationship between males and females does still matter, does still exist. And all that's happened, as I've said repeatedly, is that we allowed women into the franchise, basically in order to, because during the wars, we needed to replace the male labor, right? We invented in the Industrial Revolution. This allowed the industrialization of warfare. This created a mechanized warfare, high volume warfare, and allowed the productivity Industrial Revolution allowed a lot of warriors or soldiers to be put in the field. Well, in order to provide the workforce, we brought women back into the workforce, but now we wanted to tax them, and because the foundation of our country is based on no taxation without representation, we brought women into the voting pool. There's a lot of excuses, but really that's really what it results in. And it was also possible because the expansion of the labor pool was allowing it. So in any event, and I could go over lots of examples of how there was a displacement of men. The men came back in and displaced the women. And then this created a conflict, and this led to the 50s, the 60s, whatever. It doesn't matter what that consequence is if you just understand that whatever circumstance we're in, we divide the labor, we divide the labor between the sexes, and we eventually equilibrate on some economy that allows us to survive or not. Well, the problem, of course, is that what resulted was the suppression of the reproductive expansion that occurred in the agrarian and industrial revolutions was reversed and unfortunately redistributed downward, where reproduction had been redistributed upward under agrarianism. So that happened once. So we got basically the equivalent of bringing in slaves to a culture that was largely middle class. They weren't slaves; they were just the laboring class was all of a sudden introduced to what had been a pretty segmented society of aristocracy, a tiny middle class, and a vast proletariat. And so our ancestors in the United States tried to create a majority middle class society so they could escape all three kinds of parasites: the aristocratic parasites, the church parasites, and the peasant parasites. They tried, so America was an attempt to create a fully middle class majority society specialized for the development of middle classes, which meaning property owning productive people, and a prohibition on the church in the state, the aristocracy in the state, and the peasantry in the state, because those are the three axes of evil that bring about the attack on productivity that always results in the diminishment of the lower class and the diminishment of morals, incentives, and values that are the only ones that are unique, that are commensurable or compatible with all classes. And instead, without the middle class, everybody's incentive, which is the church, the female, the state, the male, and the peasantry, the underclass, right? The general underclass, all right? You have the general underclass and the general middle class, and you have the female and male competing. And this equilibrium is just a piece of mathematics that works on, because you can't really get away from it. And so we tried to escape all three. So what happened in the post-war period is we lifted a bunch of people up into middle-class consumption, and then right after 1970, after the post-war period had exhausted, the economy fell back down to where you can't possibly produce the kind of lifting people up into the middle class that's possible. So that happened at once. The second thing that happened is we brought women in, which is the women didn't get their own house like we had the aristocracy, the middle class, and the church for the peasantry. Women didn't get their own house. We commingled women who have completely opposite incentives. We broke it from one family, one vote, which is what one man, one property man, meaning one man with family, one vote. We broke it into so that you got one woman and one man, one vote, and one class on one vote. Because everybody in every class gets one vote without the houses to separate them, and that just means rule by the bottom. So we have spent the past 70 years undermining the middle class majority society, its norms, traditions, values, and institutions and training, all that stuff necessary to maintain the incentives that are the only set of incentives that are valuable across the classes. We've done that, and we've consistently destroyed that middle class production of norms, traditions, values, and whatever. And instead, we've created the female, the lower class decline, one repeated decline, and the repetition of lower class shrinkage. Then there's shrinking what we consider of the middle class lifestyle. We've increased that. We've decreased masculine adversarialism in all of education in the workplace. We've decreased competitive adversarialism in the workplace more, meaning our companies are no longer competitive. We've decreased the adversarialism in politics, and we've allowed the feminization, which means we're falling behind strategically, and the women have not been equally suppressed by their antisocial behavior, which we think of as face before truth, gossiping, shaming, rallying, undermining, destruction of the institutions of cultural production. We've let women do that, including the institution of marriage, and we let them do that because we allowed the capture of the institutions, starting with the academy, then the media, then the state, by the movement of Jews, to Ashkenazi Jews, from the Frankfurt School in Germany to America, and to start in New York and New York and California, which is where the two sides of the pressure come from, which is the coastal origins. We've allowed that to expand the female method of undermining by social destruction of institutions of cultural production. We've allowed that to happen. So all these things have been happened at once, and so who's to fail? Is it their failure for being Jewish as cognitively female, emotionally female, reproductively female, economically female, strategically female, and militarily female, and military in the sense that they're attacking the institutions of cultural production by the means of institutionalization of social superpredation? Are they guilty for being cognitively female? Or are we guilty for not suppressing in other words, for our utopian Christian and French Enlightenment, both of which were feminine, right? In other words, the French are a feminine culture, and those are feminine fantasies, false promises, and the Jewish feminine false promise. Both of those things we've allowed to preserve us. Christianity is a feminine religion. You can claim about patriarchy all you want, but fundamentally it's submissive, irresponsible, and says all you have to do is love. I mean, that's what it means. So you can say, well, we mix the aristocracy, our law, and Christianity into one, and that's the value system that's still present in the South. And well, I'll agree with you, but you can't. The Christianity on itself is basically Judaism, which is just basically communism, which is basically a feminine religion. So you have to have all parts of the triad: the law, the natural law of the European people, the martial military aristocracy, and the feminine church, as well as the public and the peasantry in the middle. And you have to be surrounding that peasantry with all three forces, so that the average people are acting what they think of as Christianity, but is really just European trifunctionalism, with the Christians thinking it's all Christianity, the fascists thinking it's all militarism, and the people like me thinking it's all law. Well, no, law is just a means by which we equilibrate the male and female distributions, because it's the only thing that which we have provides a common set of decidability and incentives, because that's what produces a middle class that has a ruling majority that satisfies the interests of all three dimensions of it. So no, we have this problem, and we simply didn't defend against it. Why? Because you saw Christian conservatives, aristocracy, say, well, fuck, if the underclass is going to turn against us under Marxism, fuck them. That's what happened. And so that's why you're all left behind. Well, that left the libertarians and their rule of law, tiny fraction completely thrust out, overwhelmed, and you find the Christians sitting over here thinking, rah, rah, it's all Jesus. No, it isn't. Jesus is just 1/3 of the problem, and it only works if it's in competition with the martial aristocracy and the natural law that forces a middle-class majority civilization, which is what you sort of think of as Christian culture, but it's really not. Christianity is just the religion that was maximizing the female expression, just like the military was maximizing the male expression, just like the common natural law was maximizing the neutral expression that forced a cooperation between those people of extraordinary technical, scientific, and intellectual ability, those people with emotional and feminine strategies, and those people with masculine and force strategies. And that's really just it. So this is just that's just another representation of positive pressure in the universe, negative reciprocal pressure, and the discovery of a stable relation between the two forces that makes all of life exist. All matter exist and all life exists, and it's continuing this one simple freaking algorithm. So in that sense, I'm just trying to get around to the fact that what we're going through is a normal thing, but are you being men? Are we being men? Is being Christian being a man? Or is Christian being feminine, waiting for men to do something? Is being a fascist being a European? No. Is being a Christian being a European? No. Is being a rule of law being European? Yes. That's what makes us European. The competition between the neutral rule of law, of sovereignty, and of individual reciprocal assurance of individual sovereignty, producing reciprocity and display word and deed, and the markets for voluntary markets cooperation, which allow meritocracy to rise. That's it. So that's what it means to be European, is our law. This is why Christianity, the Byzantines who forced European law, Roman law, into the religion, ended up forcing the construction of Islam. Because the reason is the Islamic law is not compatible. In other words, the law necessary for tribal cultures in that dirty, filthy place we call the Middle East, that's under conflict because it's at the intersection of all these continents, can't tolerate our law. Just like the Byzantines couldn't tolerate Germanic law. Just like we can't tolerate Latin law. Just like the Russians can't tolerate Germanic law, right? These are different legal systems. Why? Because it's law that's the first, closest, most empirical relation to the society. It's law, not religion. What does religion do? Religion justifies law and the group evolutionary strategy that's underneath it. So, you got to understand that it's law that made Europeans, right? It's the law that made our military. It's the law that made our church. And it's the combination of the law and the military and church that produced axes for all three classes, the aristocracy, the peasantry, and the middle class. And it's only the middle class that produces the majority incentives that produce the prosperity we think of Europe as European excellence, because that European excellence is the production of science, reason, evidence, empiricism, science, technology that was sold to the aristocracy as military competition and delivered to the peasantry as economic prosperity. It's only the middle class that makes that happen. Period. There's no argument here. So if you want to think about this, you're going to only ally the right around the law, because the only thing the right has in common, because of trifunctionalism, is the law, and that law is what makes us prosperous. That's it. That's how it comes down to. And so if I could, that's all there is. That's what European means. It means truth before face, regardless of cost, under truth, the truth and duty, sovereignty, reciprocity, and demonstrated interests. And the result of which is we use the militia to ensure ourselves, which is why we're not all slaves like everybody else. The price then of buying into the reciprocal insurance of sovereignty and reciprocity is the military. That's what you did. You buy your way in by taking an equal risk to the rest of the men, by ensuring one another's sovereignty and reciprocity. What can women do? They can't. They can only produce children suitable for reproduction of females, and the military sacrifice at males, despite the fact that it puts female and her children at risk. That's it. So it's just an algorithm. It isn't a matter of opinion or feelings. You move one variable in that triangle and you get a different society. You monopolize the state and you get China. You monopolize the church and you get Islam. You monopolize culture, which is sort of in the middle there, you get India. And the problem is India gets conquered. China can only can't adapt as fast as us. And the Middle East regresses into the lowest common denominator, and Africa simply can't put it together because they're still in the four families model. I mean, which is, I don't want to go into it here. So, I mean, these aren't choices. In other words, these aren't. There's no other way to change this physics of the human equilibrium. You're stuck with one of those choices and only one of them produces continuous recursive evolutionary velocity that defeats the regression to the mean, defeats regression to Malthusian limits. And that's the European. And the European is only possible because of rule of law. Period. End of story. That's social science, political science, sociology, psychology, done. That's it. That's all there is. Everything else is just jerking off so you can try to advance your whatever is your axes of the triangle. So anyway, so that's why the right fails. Is the only way to unify is under the law, and all the elites followed the law, and you lost your elites. And what am I doing? I'm the only guy sitting here saying, it's the law, you idiots. All right. So that's number one. So now I'm going to move on to, okay, what is the issue here with, what are some topics I wanted to cover? I wanted to cover today issues from the manosphere. And they're all related to this basic idea, is that every attempt at proposing equality, the end of scarcity, the equality of human nature, the equality of human malleability, and that there is no accumulated genetic load and no need for natural selection. These are just attempts to evade voluntary exchange under the law and then limiting our insurance of one another. In other words, people who drop out or fail, to charity in exchange for conformity, which means doing no harm to the commons. In effect, that's what the church was doing. The church was serving as saying, don't do any harm and you can be insured by the polity. And that's what they converted in that from a via negativa to a via positiva of saying do good. Then if you were able to do that, you would have a church court for morality, and then you would have the common court for those who had property. You have the manor court for those who had manners, and you would have the parliament or the king's court for dispute between manners. And this is what we mean by this hierarchy. And this is what reflects slavery, serfdom, peasantry, freeman, citizen, sovereign, is this same hierarchy. But what is that hierarchy? It's just how much capital are you capable of managing? In other words, are you capable of managing capital? So, and what is the amount of capital you can insure? If you can't demonstrate you can insure capital, then to your peers, then you can't have influence because if you've demonstrated your incompetence in influence. By the way, I want to just interject here that the Normans pretty much outlawed slavery in 1066, right? And this was England hasn't had this for a while. We converted it to indentured servitude, which is how it should be, which is you can't or I can't support myself, so I'm selling my responsibility to someone else in exchange for not being responsible, which is really somewhat what how the military is indentured servitude. Then you have the serf, which doesn't mean you don't have rights. It means that it's just like you and I bought an apartment block, that we could sell the apartment block to some other landholder, right? And that landholder would manage and profit from the apartment block. But there's no difference in your rights, right? You just are, you have a right to work that land and a right to maintain your family on that land. So that's what a serf means in England. It doesn't mean the same. So we use this term as if serf means the same thing across Eurasia. It doesn't. You might just be you might just be a slave that has to donate some of its labor, and from then we move out from labor to money. And then a freeman is a person who isn't attached to any land, right? Who has the ability, has mobile ability, and maybe has his own land, right? Or he rents the land directly rather than he's attached to the land. In other words, he's an property owner rather than a renter. I mean, that's all it is. So there's no difference today between today and the medieval world, except for the fanciful names we invented for the classes. But we all work by the same feudal system because, frankly, we have to. There's no other way. We just call it capitalism today, which means meritocracy, and they used it meritocracy too. The difference is there's a lot less risk today of you screwing up society because we're so much more wealthy than we were in the past. Anyway, so basically any claim of equality is an attempt at theft. It's a fraud. So the purpose of the reason for equity, which is what the law gives us, is that when they say the law is blind, it's blind to the fact that it's supposed to be blind to the fact that you're rich and I'm poor, or I'm middle class and you're poor, or we're both. It doesn't supposed to matter anymore because in a court of equity, we're just solving questions of demonstrated interest. In other words, are we stealing from each other? That's all we have. So the point of courts of equity, of courts of our ancient common law, is always one purpose. It's to prohibit us from parasitism on each other, which causes conflict, which causes decrease in economic velocity, which causes increase in costs of policing, increase in the size of government. In other words, that's what's important. Increase in size of government comes from increase in conflict. Then what occurs, in other words, rule of law is dependent upon sufficient suppression of conflict that the state doesn't have to heavily invest in the mediation of conflicts and the correction of them. So that's why it's a very low tolerance law. And so we have equality under the law. In other words, via negativa equality in our disputes. We have via positiva equality in our ability and our meritocratic ability to achieve influence in proportion to our ability to manage capital, and we have equality in responsibility once we're introduced to this hierarchy to ensure each other's sovereignty, self-determination by sovereignty, reciprocity, in demonstrated interest by under display, word, and deed. Sovereignty and demonstrated interest by reciprocity and display, word, and deed. So it's really not complex. But also, that point is that's not really a goofy thing there. I mean, that's just another way of producing the commons by which we all profit by reducing the cost of people being parasitic upon the private and the common. So that's why we developed what I call commonsism, which is the real European strategy. The European strategy is really, really simple. And that's that we suppress all this means of stuff because in doing so, we imposition of costs, we exhaustively suppress it. We exhaustively include people in the act of suppressing it. Every man's a sheriff, every man's a soldier, every man that's in the franchise is basically a citizen, whether freeman or whether serf, freeman, or citizen or sovereign, and we all insure each other against that. And this makes it possible to produce the surpluses because there's lower frictions and the economic velocity that makes us produce commons, which is why Europe's a vast open air museum and the rest of the world looks like some version of favelas. It's because we can produce commons because every man's a sheriff and every man's a soldier and no one else can. And that's because they didn't choose the law as their primary axes of cooperation. They chose authority of force or authority of scripture, or the absence of authority, which is India, and or the absence of anything other than tradition, which is the limit on the ability to grow commons. So this is, again, it's just math. It's the mathematics of the physics of cooperation between the sexes, classes, tribes, and nations. You can't get out of it, and no matter what you do, that equilibrium is physics, and over time it will re-equilibrate. This is important for the manosphere question. Over time, it will re-equilibrate. The difference is that the universe, that we can remember, that's what makes us different from the rest of the universe, is that we can remember, we can predict, and we can choose our cooperation. The universe can't. It just bumps into each other and can make stuff happen under a certain temperature and pressure, or it can't. And well, we get to choose that and then construct it, at least within this narrow temperature range that makes complex carbon molecules possible. In this, complex carbon molecules possible with in the presence of this universal solvent we call water. Okay, so now what happens? What's the theme? Females undermine alphas. Think about that in economic terms. Women destroy all attempts at capitalization in order to increase their ability for hyperconsumption. In other words, that's what it means. I don't want to have my ability to consume genes limited to this guy, because I want to be able to use seduction to obtain goods from as many men as possible. So what do women do? They undermine. So this is the means of social construction. Do they think about it? No. Do they strategize about it? No. Do they feel it? Yes. Women are instinctual creatures. Men are instinctual creatures. The difference is our instinct is for truth because we have to solve real material problems of others and the universe between ourselves and the females and children we herd. And women are worried about what they can do within that corral to control their consumption for themselves and their children. And our cognition evolved to worry about the other men, our brothers and cousins, and the enemies that we want to take and the territory we control in order to maintain a healthy pool of females like we maintain cattle. And that's really what it comes from. So that's what we did. We evolved to do that. So we have a temporal spatial bias, and they have an experiential bias. Their experiential bias is necessary, and it doesn't show before puberty. As soon as they hit puberty, they go crazy. What does it go crazy? It's not really. It's that they're developing the ability to extend their emotional and cognitive load onto others at the least cost. And so a woman with 4, 5, 6 kids is not crazy. They can't afford to be. That's what they evolved. They evolved for that cognitive load. Well, what did men evolve for? We'd evolved for a political and spatial and resource load. And this is really easy by just changing what the brain is incentivized to calculate by minor modifications in biochemistry as we're evolving and maturing. It's not even complicated. So you just build us to go this way. So that's what's happened. But once you understand, they don't know what they're doing. You have to be the grown-ups in the room. And you can't treat them as Christian equals. You can't treat other peoples as Christian equals. You have to look at the world as we're all unequal. And in the end, who pays whose reproductive cost? The reproductive cost of males is maintaining a pool of females from introgression by other males. In other words, family, polity, tribe, nation, right? I mean, that's what we're doing. We're preventing introgression against our females. Well, do females care? No, they're happy to screw you over. There's no problem, because all they're looking for is hyperconsumption, the largest number of options at the lowest possible cost. That's the underlying issue. So what we did under our law, which is why women are more equal in Western civilization than anyone else, is we merely acknowledged this difference, and our common law used to equally suppress male misbehavior, antisocial behavior, as female antisocial behavior. But what happened was this was undermined by the Marxist, neo-Marxist, postmodern feminist movement as a prohibition on the suppression. In other words, they're using the female method of warfare to undermine because of our political structure doesn't separate houses for males and females and create a market. They're using their numbers to, in other words, there's always more at the bottom than the top. There's usually more women, and women will have less diverse opinions than men. So in an event, because they have more homogenous strategy compared to men, and they're less divergent than men. So women will do what they always do, which is undermine their males in order to increase the amount of gossiping, raming, shaming, undermining, denial, face before truth, theft and parasitism, and destruction of male formations of capital. They'll do that whenever possible because they don't even have to think about it. And that's why you see Naxalt as the universal example of human female behavior. Like, well, I didn't. Well, it doesn't matter what you think. That's an idiosyncratic little thing. It matters what the data says. But how do they feel if? Well, it doesn't matter. It matters what the demographic says. We're talking about a question. But what about this? Not all X are like that. Well, it doesn't matter because we're talking about a distribution and a political system of people with divergent interests. So what is a woman trying to do? She's not trying to produce a good. She's trying to undermine the ability for males to produce capital, which allows us to produce commons. In other words, women are just burning down capital. In other words, they're literally lighting the society on fire. And who in the ancient world, the Jewish Christians, and who Marxist, neo-Marxist, feminist, postmodernists, PC folks, who are they doing it? They're doing the same thing. Burn down the system of Europeans that makes it possible for males to maximize the accumulation of cultural, institutional, genetic, and fixed capital and territorial capital. They're destroying it. Do they know any better? No. And then they seek special privilege because they're women, and because they're women and they aren't worried about intellectual consistency. Then they just say, well, we're women in this case and we're equal in this case. In other words, they just throw shit at the wall to destroy the informational system. So the only way you can do that, fix that, is with the truth. And you have to enforce the truth, because the truth is the means that produces the ability to force people into cooperation, which maintains natural selection, which is converted into the production of commons, which provides the wealth by which we maintain our competitive advantage over people and our relative condition in the advancement of civilization. That's it. It's not complicated. The thing is, we've allowed this institution to happen. We've allowed the offshoring of jobs. We've allowed the offshoring of the jobs that produce the knowledge, that produce the capital we call skills. We've allowed the immigration of people who are driving down the median, increasing the demand for government, increasing the destruction of the middle class. We've allowed the redistribution to women who have single mothers who are parasitic on the state. We've allowed that redistribution to happen, even though it's just theft. And instead of suppressing the behavior of women, like the eugenicist said, which is, if you've got bad behavior, you lose your tubes. Same thing for men, for that matter. So if we tend to hang men, which was a much better strategy, because if you look at it, the most crimes created by men are created by a tiny fraction of super predators who are absolutely positively unretrievable. So that's the underlying algorithm. There's nothing complex here. I mean, I'm frustrated by the fact that we let this happen, and there's only one way men fix problem. How do you police and enforce theft? There's only one way. You organize the organized application of force to deny all aspects of theft, regardless of the excuse. Now, has any criminal in history ever said, yes, we need that law? Actually, it does happen in the middle class. You'll see this is Actually, if you regulate my industry, I don't have to do bad stuff in order to stay alive. So if you regulate my industry, then I can then and you limit us all to good stuff, I can compete by good stuff. But if you don't regulate my industry, you don't police it, and you don't provide me with means of juridical defense, then I have to go down, race to the bottom like everybody else does. So, well, it's the same thing here. If we don't regulate the behavior of the antisocial and military behavior of females and those who, the Jews are the primary intellectuals that force the female strategy, then you're stuck in the position of saying, well, we're basically allowing theft to happen, and we're sitting here letting ourselves be intertemporally raped by the involuntary choice limitation of our choice on reproduction, the way females are temporarily raped by the removal of their choice of reproduction. It's the same freaking thing in a different timeline. So there's no difference. I mean, the women are just traumatized by temporal rape, as we're as angry and traumatized by intertemporal rape. It's the same freaking thing, because rape, what does rape mean? It means the use of some sort of criminality to interfere with your system of reproduction, which for men is organizing a polity that produces the greatest potential to transmit their genes. So I mean, it's physics. Have I ranted about that enough? That one subject enough? So we got to understand a little bit about the marriage thing. So I started out saying, guys, this marriage thing, was part of the agrarian age. Pairing off happened. It's useful because why? Because the primary thing men will kill for is access to sex and reproduction. That's it. I mean, that's the thing men kill for. And so we invented marriage to be able to pairing off to limit that. And it also gave men access to sex and reproduction, and it gave women somewhat of a choice of who they were going to reproduce with. However, it didn't produce a power distribution. In other words, a power distribution for males would be Genghis Khan, who just got as many women as he wanted. A power distribution of females would every woman got the top guy. In other words, got to be inseminated by the top guy. And then all the other men had to pay for Genghis Khan's children, and all the other women had to pay. All the other men and women had to pay for the females' selection of the optimum. So that's what's a power distribution. But a Nash equilibrium, a Pareto distribution, is meritocratic, which is what we usually see in the assortative mating process. And the Nash equilibrium is marriage, whereas under a power distribution of prohibition on harms, a Pareto meritocratic distribution of control of capital and a management of capital, and a Nash equilibrium of sexual relations and family. That's the best everybody can do, even if it's not the best that many individuals could do better under a certain circumstance at the expense of all the rest. So this is what law produces. Our law produces these three equilibriums. Now, so a couple of things emerge here is that a family then evolved, as we understand it, under agrarianism, because agrarianism allowed you to produce fixed capital and territorial capital. There's land. It allowed you to produce, to gather animals. It allowed you to produce tools, a fixed residence. And so you could accumulate this capital, which allowed the intergenerational transfer of assets across families. And we sort of live in this world now where we're so wealthy we can't grasp it. But we were poor, right? People were desperately dirt poor on the Malthusian edge of survival at all times, where a single bad harvest meant a lot of people died. So in that world, assets were incredibly valuable things because they were so difficult to produce. So, people who could hold and produce assets, families who could inject discipline did well, and those people who didn't, and were sort of somewhat selected out. So the family and marriage are a product of the kind of capital organization that occurred under agrarianism. But now we're in a position where a lot has really, really changed. we had the Industrial Revolution come in. We had the post-war boom, which lifted vast, in just a few decades, we took almost everybody from the farm to almost everybody off the farm. And we had a tremendous leap in technological leap that made all these people able to go into the middle class, but we indoctrinated them into the middle class. So by the early 60s, we had this behavior. Well, that's not really true, because as early as the 50s, you start to see the underclass rebellion against being pushed into middle class norms, which we think of as the James Dean effect. This is the proletarian working class resurgence. And then you see the 60s countercultural revolution, which is a proletarian revolution against integration of the middle class. And at the same time, you see the introduction of the Jews that came over and quite by design converted class warfare Marxism to identity sex warfare, and their intention was to weaponize blacks against the homogenous state, and they successfully did that. By the 70s, wasn't going to work, that the socialist experiment was failing, but by that time they'd already gotten root, and they'd gotten root in our universities, and they basically destroyed our universities, which were our church, and they brought in this set of crap. And so what's happened is that they created all these false academic studies to fund the production of propaganda, and they brought women in who are suckers for false promise, because that's their intuition, is that they always see males as the proxy for the laws of nature, and men see females as the intermediary step between children who are completely dependent and women who are just their advocates. But they don't understand the world. They don't understand and aren't willing to pay the costs we are of cellular and emotional and psychological and physical damage in order to interact with the full world. So that's what you saw during that period. Well, the 80s were a bit of a resurgence, but there was this opportunity once in the 90s, where we sort of brought in all these. By then, we brought in enough immigrants that first the Clintons, then the Obamas could successfully unite with this academic class and be trained by them, unite with this new academic class, unite with the control of the financial sector, control the media sector, to go full-on warfare against our institutions of cultural production. And then when you saw in the Clinton failure under Trump's is that the realization of the people that something is, the hopefulness of conservatives was a lost cause, and that we needed to have a counter revolution. And you saw them panic in the Jewish sector, the ADL, the SPLC, the Jewish activist groups, the leftist academy, the financial sector, which is starting with BlackRock, working the idea down through this is who's driving all this corporate behavior. You saw them, the academy, and the state bureaucracy, all who'd been indoctrinated by this post-war Frankfurt School ideology of undermining. They brought that in, and they'd become enough a member of our society that they revolted. And Trump tried to do it, but of course, you can't do that. You literally have to do what he's sort of looking at now, which is producing basically an intellectual, which is what I'm doing, an intellectual, a social, and a political army that is sufficient to replace that entire bureaucratic system with people who are no longer part of that cult of destruction of Western civilization from within, under these false promises that we can bring about another Bolshevik revolution here, this time not against the working class, against the white majority European masculine middle class rule of law, truth before face, scientific empirical civilization, but instead they're trying to bring about the opposite, which is undermining it, which is dragging the rest of us down to the degradation of the Southern Americans, the Southern Europeans, the Middle East, if not so far as India and China. So they're trying to bring us down into, in other words, they're trying to accomplish the goal of the Semitic civilization, was that all these religions evolved in response to the Indo-European expansion, which they saw as an intrinsic threat produced by the combination of the Persians and the Europeans. And so they developed, they went from their old strategy to a purely feminine strategy of undermining, because their low trust society can't organize by any other means. So that's why you see no corporations that are female. In other words, you can't find polities, corporations, anything that's organized under the female method. The same thing in the Middle East. You can only find raiding by groups of tribes under an ideology, basically using the female method of warfare expressed as physical raiding by males. You can only see this destructive process. You don't see them producing an equally competitive alternative that would be more desirable than the Western or the Indian or the Chinese model. You see them only engaging in undermining, critique, because they don't have the male creative capacity. Their civilization hasn't got it. Well, this is why you see the Jews as the most educated people in the Middle Ages, but they produce absolutely nothing. Whereas if we take Europeans, you put them in a position where there's enough trade going on, we automatically drag mankind kicking and screaming against its will out of its evolutionary backwater in a few centuries. I'm ranting. So what is the next topic here? So been trying to predict the direction of marriage and mating over this century, and we're increasingly returning to this historical norm. Our historical norm is pairing off, for what we've called serial marriage, and the serial marriage, of course, generates demand, limits our ability to reduce the cost of family and reduce the cost of, because cohabitation incomes are, it's cooperation, right? It reduces costs. So we're doing that. We're redistributing reproduction downward, and we're redistributing reproduction to females, and we're extracting money from males to do it. And it's worse at the political scale. The only people who aren't a net loss on for taxation are white males over 35. So, white males over 35 are paying for their own destruction, and their own destruction of their reproduction, their own destruction of their civilizational capital, their own destruction of their territorial capital, their cultural capital, their institutional capital, their knowledge capital, and their ability in the future to continue to drag mankind forward by our continued almost unique ability to innovate faster than anybody else, which is probably due to the fact that we're more sexually dimorphic than all the other races, and that our masculinity seems to be producing a combination of our masculine dimorphism and our cognitive dimorphism and our degree of neoteny, which has not gone as far as East Asians, is producing enough autists per capita to maintain a pace of innovation that no other group of population can even come close to. Whereas you see in the Ashkenazi demographic, they do innovate, but it's always in the female method of baiting into hazard by false promise of freedom from the laws of the universe. So I've been trying to predict this, and I really don't see any difficulty in doing so. We lifted the lower classes into the middle class during the Industrial Revolution and the post-war income bubble. We're seeing return to type, in other words, return to serial relationships as the economic capacity of the lower middle, working, laboring underclasses are no longer able to produce enough male competitive advantage to purchase the high cost of female attention, which is really expensive. That's what you want the income stream for, is you're buying exclusivity to female attention in exchange for your productivity. Yeah, the friendship and marriage and all that stuff goes along with it, but look how long they last. Eros and attractiveness last a few years. Friendship lasts a little longer, but it's not like, and then the problem is then reciprocal care once your sexual and economic market value have decreased, that the only people that it's worth investing in you is your opposite sex that you've been married to. So this economy is being undermined, but it's being undermined by debt expansion, deindustrialization, offshoring, and immigration of lower classes who drive the prices of labor down, which prevent it. It's being undermined by monetary redistribution to the financial sector, to the political sector, and to those people who are reproducing at your expense. So, I mean, this is just theft at vast scales under the premise that creating dysgenic reproduction, destruction of civilization, capital on a scale never before seen in history, or at least not seen since the destruction of the great cities of the ancient world. I mean, there's nothing like this in history, including the plagues. So, I mean, this is just like communism, the Jewish communism was such a destructive force. Neo-Marxism, postmodernism, PC woke, anti-male feminism are an equally destructive force, more so than the Great Plagues. I mean, they're worse than the Black Plague. So, but who's allowing this to happen? It's us. So, I mean, you can't afford to, in this position, we can't afford this. I mean, women are, if we add social media to it, what we've done is we've created the same fantasy that was pretty useful to bait people into middle class consumption at the expense of debt, right? That's what we did. We bait people into more consumption by destroying the family such that women were introduced into the workforce, but all their income was extracted as taxes, making us all poorer, right? And so we can't afford to reproduce, and now we can't even afford to get married. Because we can't afford to pay for one another. And so, I mean, it's just this incredibly destructive force. So you add on top of social media, because what it does, what social media is basically advertising, right? It's cheap advertising. It's like, just as the internet made small businesses able to advertise their products and services, the internet and these dating structures made individuals able to advertise their sexual market value. The problem is it creates the illusion that you're going to get access to supermarket. It's the same thing as access to this any different man or woman than you would under normal circumstances. You're not. Well, you're not going to get that. You're not going to get any better man or woman than you would by natural selection if you didn't do this. So in other words, classes, reproduction is sorted by classes, and it's all predictable. And so you're not going to get anything. I mean, men are happy to marry down for biological, phenotypical attractiveness, and women want to marry up for cognitive and competitive attractiveness. And okay, that's great, but that just turns into some sort of game where we actually sort, and it turns out that most people marry people within their classes. If they don't, their marriage lasts 5 minutes. So what's happened here is we've allowed the same false advertising in the dating market as we have in the financial market, as we had in the American dream market, as we had in the debt market, as we had, so we've allowed this false advertising to go on. And, I would say, well, what would happen if you had to document all your sex partners in order to enter in a marriage contract, or by definition, you were conducting a fraud? Well, I mean, simple stuff like that would be relatively easy. But what's worse is that we've uninsured marriage. We've undermined the economy sufficiently that women can survive in low-income occupations. So what happens, women pay a lot of money to go to college. They get a low-income occupation, which has displaced men from that. The problem is the women don't go anywhere in those low-income occupations, where those men would sort. So it's the same thing as the minimum wage. You put people in minimum wage, you pay them enough, but pay them enough for minimum wage, they stay there, right? Whereas the point of minimum wage is to move people in here so they develop the basic working behaviors that they move upward, but they don't. They just block the channel. So all these channels are being blocked. So what's happening? So women can survive in these low-income occupations for the first time, but they can't maintain it once they have a couple of kids and they're trying to manage child rearing and income and consume signals for attention that they're so desperate for in the absence of it. So, and conversely, men can't produce sufficient income to generate demand for their supply of resources in exchange for regular sex and reproduction. So women are keeping their options open, and men can't nail down an option, even though at the end, all that's happened is you've ended up with the same quality person, you would end up probably worse, you've burned. This is important. What you've burned is your period of, you know, you have go through physical development. We think of this young adulthood, this early adulthood, as sexual, purely sexual terms, but that's not what's going on. You're actually burning down your adaptive capacity for a member of the opposite sex. In other words, you've developed selfishness and non-compromisation, which is why you see some of these people, if they get married or a relationship when they're fairly young, and they go through their sexually and reproductive adaptive period together, they are more like family members who have less divergent wants and needs, and they've learned how to compromise before they've learned how to hyperconsume. So we've destroyed that process too. So college is terrible. What we need people to be is in working, and then we should only send people to college. I mean, we should have college courses projected basically into every high school, so that it's a continuation of high school, because this is now technologically feasible. And then we should not turn college into basically a sex party for 4 years, which destroys your sexual market value, as well as destroys your adaptive capacity. So you're actually destroying the ability to maintain long-term durable relationships. So I mean, we're doing everything you could possibly do wrong by this false promise that there are no constraints, which is really what the left is, right? And it's the same thing as the female strategy. There are no constraints to hyperconsumption. Any constraint on hyperconsumption is oppression. It's not the laws of the universe, it's paternalism. No, it's just that we're responsible for capitalization, you're responsible for consumption, and the only time that works is if there's a reciprocal trade. Okay, fine. It's not fucking complicated. And if you think you can get out of it, you can't. It's physics. You know why? Because anybody who gets out of it, in other words, who tries to get out of it, is doing what you're doing, which is you're off the genetic map. You're gone. All your ancestors, all their works, all their suffering, all their savings, all their hard work, all their attempts to produce you was vaporized by your attempt at seeing if you could marry up, or in other words, for men, and getting a higher quality, more attractive female, and in women getting an alpha, and neither one of you get it, and all you do is end up at life disappointed. Why? Because of the false promise you could, the false advertising of the dating market, the false advertising of the commercial market, the false advertising of the financial market, the false advertising of the academic market, the false promising of the undereducational market, the false promise of all these spectrums, this incredible, vast, feminine set of lies that says you live in the unconstrained vision. So what am I trying to do? I'm just trying to find how to restore the incentives. Not return to the past, how to restore incentives. Well, you do that really by prohibiting the female means of warfare, just like we prohibit the male, and you prevent reinsure marriage, right? You put the constraints back on marriage, which is, what is a marriage? A marriage is formation of a corporation that for you is a reciprocal guarantee of intertemporal care, in other words, and the benefits of doing so. And the reason it's public is the community is ensuring non-interference in the marriage, so that you don't create the moral hazard of making have to sustain two separate domiciles, the high cost of doing that, and pushing women and men both down into lower economic classes by doing so. And thirdly, by creating the moral hazard that requires redistribution of a female with children who needs external support in order to survive. So it's easy to fix this. Restore marriage as a corporation, end community property, end alimony and child support, restore blame in marriage, and restore fault in marriage, and restore the liability for interference in marriage. You want to see things disappear overnight? You will. You want to see male and female behavior overnight? Fine, because the reason for political system, in other words, family is the first corporation, not business, not industry, not polity. Those things all arise from this first self-sacrifice to produce commons through the combination of capital that needs to be intermixed in order to be able to produce goods, children. And generations are necessary for maintaining the intergenerational transfer of assets that we think of as culture and institutions and wealth and prosperity and habits and norms and traditions. So this is it. It's not complicated. But it's only complicated if you let the female set of lies distract you because we're naturally biased towards service of the female, right? We're actually, because we want to serve, right? We want to be valued. In other words, our self-worth is partly tied up in male approval, which tells us our sexual market value, right? It tells women our sexual market value, and female service, which maintains the continuous stimulation of success at achieving that market value. And this is just physics. It's not like psychological or emotional, because all psychology and all emotions are just expressions of the physics of the problem of the cooperation between the sexes, which is the maximization of the opportunity for capital accumulation. We think of it as biomass, and that's it. And so that's what we have to do. We don't have a choice, and we'll be gone if we don't. That's why I say the biggest risk to the future of humanity isn't aliens, it isn't volcanoes. It's this fallacy that we're not responsible for production of intergenerational capital and the continuation of natural selection, because we want to satisfy the female political fantasy of equality rather than the female familial and social demonstration of equality, which is the only place empathy has any meaning. Empathy is only valuable if it's empirical. Empathy isn't valuable if it's theoretical. And furthermore, it's the same thing here. The politicization doesn't apply at the family social level. It doesn't, because that's empirical at grand scale. In other words, it's talking about very large averages, and at the family and prison, you have to use individual discretion. So these things aren't the same. You can't scale the female up or the male down. So we've just, I'm just trying to discover the policy changes and legal changes, and somewhat law as philosophy and educational changes, institutional changes that would restore it. And all it is prohibit the female method of warfare and restore the equilibrium market between the sexes. That's it. It doesn't take much, And everybody's, well, you can't do it with law. And I'm like, I just got spent telling you how religion is a byproduct of law, and law is a byproduct of group evolutionary strategy, and group evolutionary strategy is a matters of genetic composition and geography. Okay, that's it. It's just, So yeah, it's law, and our law drives everything else. And once the most important thing is our law is written down. And so that's what I've done that previous generations haven't done, is I've converted the 5,000 years of evolution of the European group evolutionary strategy into the trifunctional method, including the law, which emerged as the Germanic common law, Roman law, the Germanic common law, mostly the Germanic, and finally the English development of the modern state, which turned out to be the English codification of the common law in its loose terms. In other words, it's not written down, it's just practice. And the Americans wrote some of it down, but didn't write down the rest, which was Blackstone and the Foundations of Natural Law and its logical composition. All I've done is formalize what we've been doing. I didn't discover anything. In other words, I didn't invent anything. I've just discovered, captured, written down as a science and a formal logic, because that's what a science does. It produces, the science is the means of producing testimony, which over time, produces evidence, which is testifiable, which over time produces the first principles, and the first principles are what are irreducible. In other words, there's nothing they can be reduced to. And once you're at first principles, then you can construct everything from first principles, and then you can test whether it's true or not. So all I've done is I've converted law from a tradition to a philosophy, to a science, to a formal logic, and a formal logic meaning informal operational logic, not a set logic, nor like a verbal logic, but an operational logic, meaning engineering, physics. I've written it down at that level so that we can equally suppress the female method of antisocial behavior and warfare against the institutions of cultural production, just like we've suppressed the male, and that we can force each other into reciprocal exchanges, then produce the economy that makes it possible for us to do so, and then reduce the institution of marriage and the rewards for marriage the same way we've produced the rewards for the institution of businesses, corporations, industries, and polities. We produce those incentives back so that women and men can't parasite on each other and are forced to follow our biological net or not benefit from the insurance of by the polity. And that's it. If you can't adhere to those things, you can't be insured by the polity. That's what it means. That's what marriage is. It's a corporation insured by the polity, just like the state insures my business corporation by the polity by limiting liability and putting constraints on what we can do in the commons. Bang! It's the same thing with marriage. We didn't invent the corporation like everybody thinks it's some modern thing. What do you think our ancestors came from? Those other people in the primitive world, they stayed tribal and they just had cities build up around them because they were along rivers. We had the different thing. Now there's pirates, right, of boats, right? But we had carts, right? So you and I and our ancestors, they spent the winters along the rivers in the Dnieper and over there in Russia and southern and Ukraine. We spent the winters there, and on the summers you get your cart, you get your family, and you figure out with a bunch of other families, you go out there and you do that. But you understand that while you're grazing, you're also raiding. In other words, a Viking might be farming, but he might also go raiding. In other words, a Dane or a Scandinavian might be a farmer, but then he would go Viking. Well, our ancestors on the steppe did the same thing. They spent the winters in winter camps near the water, and then they took during the summers, they took the herds out there, and while they were out there, they went Viking, which means stealing the other guy's cattle. But this is where the corporation comes from. It's a voluntary association of people who take risk capital, and the only way to manage a corporation is by a contract, and a contract of meritocracy, because military activity under high risk is the most empirical thing man can attempt. There's nothing less forgiving than war. So, in any event, so I don't think this is a very difficult problem. I mean, it's a difficult problem if you don't understand it. But once you understand it, it's really quite simple. The problem is that we've allowed the propagation of falsehoods by not, if you could put a warning label on cigarettes that says blah blah blah, you'll get cancer if you get this. Why isn't there the equal warning label on dating sites? Is you're giving up, you're not going to get better than you can get anyway, no matter what you do here. You're going to burn your sexual market value. You're going to burn your reproductive capacity, and most of all, you're going to burn your ability to enter into a long-term sustainable marriage, because you've burned your ability to get into to use that period of behavioral development, especially important to males, of your mid-teens to early 20s to form sexual compromise with a mate. You're giving up that ability. And so what you're doing is you're maximizing selfishness by pursuit of a false opportunity that you'll ever matively assort as other than you can matively assort to. I mean, that's it. That's what's happening. Now, I'm not against, I'm not saying don't experiment with sexual partners, but we have to get rid of the illusion that women are going to go upscale and men are going to go up. It doesn't happen. I mean, we've got the great value of the dating sites is we have such incredible empirical evidence about what really happens, and it's horrifying, because all those, it's just as big a lie as everything else. All right. So have I gone into this? America's an economic institution. It adapts to whatever circumstances. We're regressing to type. We're regressing to type because of the causes I've said. So what can I say? We're restoring marriage as I wouldn't want to call it a business venture, but as a corporation. There's a historical reason for pairing off under hunter-gatherers. There's a historical reason for marriage under agrarianism and property. The invention of romantic love was in response to the plague. There's lots of work on this. And why was it in response to the plague? And why did fantasy, childish literature emerge at this time? Because the older population died off, and there was more so than the younger population. And so we had, just like now we have a plethora of young people in some countries, we had a plethora of young people. It's the same. All right. So that happened. So romantic love was invented during that period. We invented chivalry for the same reason. The Vikings had come in; they had created so much catastrophe. Their church was trying to control this. Because if you know what a knight was in previous history, it's basically, you understand that manners and knights of the old world were a little bit like Chicago gangsters and their thugs, right? That's really what it is. As they were trying to turn this into a virtuous position, it didn't actually take hold at all. It took hold later on as a mythology that was helpful for the emergent middle class. And this merged under the Industrial Revolution and under the Darwinian expansion as the female on a pedestal stuff, part of the Romantic period, which is again an attempt to the Romantic period. This female on a pedestal was an attempt to bring us back to our ancient religion, because in the 1800s was the Red German Restoration, the Germanic restoration of our myths, the restoration of our myths and fables and our own self-awareness. In other words, just as Italy went through its Renaissance. Renaissance? Yeah, Renaissance. Germany went through its Renaissance. The Germanic peoples went through their Renaissance in the 1800s, 1800s during the Romantic period, and we became aware of our history. We tried to bring it back. The Jewish Marxists revolted because they couldn't bear that happening, and they had enough influence they are masters of propaganda and undermining and false promise, and so they institutionalized that as false promises that would undermine it, produce the world wars. Anyway, so this is a natural production of it. So we had the repetition of the post-war capture of the church. In other words, the Darwin destroyed the church. The academy took over the church. It was doing fine by about 1920. But what happened was the Jewish movement to the USA, bringing about this thing that now the academy wasn't playing second fiddle. It could actually take over the power of the church with this new false promise. They did. They had a new income stream during the 50s and the 60s because of the post-war lift up and whatever. They had the introduction of women, which meant that they had a new pool of idiots to sell this. And I said that on purpose. New pool of suckers to sell this false promise to, who were genetically biased to believe it. They had the ability to cast the eugenics movement because of the Nazis as horrific, rather than what the pre-war liberals had said it was not necessary. They had all these things. They brought all this in here, and they've conducted a warfare against our institutions. So it's just a repetition of what the Jews did with the Christianity and bring it into Roman civilization. And they did it the same way by undermining from the bottom, by false promise of something that could not be had. And the end result was after the German invasions, the aristocracy was no longer to bring people back into nationalism. So just as we see today, the state people found opportunity in the church that couldn't be reconstructed in the state. And so we have experienced the Dark Ages. So we're stuck in a future where debt, economy, geostrategy, political systems, and without a reformation, we just can't, no change can be reproduced, because you can't use something like the church. It can't be produced we can't beat the ultimate false promise of freedom from all the laws of nature, satisfying the female belief in the absence of constraints on the hyper construction by blaming white males who are the interface between reality and them as oppressors, instead of the people that are transforming the universe into something these women can use, and they're thankless hyper consumers because of it, who want to avoid responsibility and cost at all opportunities. Well, I mean, that's what's gonna happen. I mean, it's just not. We need some way of getting out of it. We have to change it, and the only way to change that is if we say enough. and we have to say enough, and we have to say enough with a plan. And it can't be Nazi church or something else. It has to be, here's a plan. And we're going to restore this for those of us who want to have an advanced society. And for those of you who want to turn into the Middle East and whatever, you can have some free cities, go ahead. But otherwise, we're going to have to fight over it. That's all that's got to happen. The thing is that we have to deprive the right, or the conservatives in general. I'll get away from trying to get away from using the right. We have to get away from conservatives and libertarians thinking that libertarianism, which is a fantasy, the church, which is a fantasy, or the totalitarian state, which is a fantasy, are anything other than the three ends of the triangle saying they all know how to fail. So what I'm saying is, the only way you unify loyalty is around the law, which makes the 3 points of the triangle able to cooperate on shared ends, despite slightly different interests in means. So yeah. So I don't want to go any further on this thing. I might have gone through it all. So in essence, this is the line of thought I'm sort of developing, is that there's a lot of mythology out there, and how are we going to correct that mythology before it's too late? And how are we going to spread the knowledge of what's going on in terms that can be used to rationally defeat the kind of idiots who say women must believe and reason is male patriarchy. Reason is the way we cooperate and force each other into voluntary exchanges. Law is the means by which we force each other into voluntary exchanges. Just truth is the means by which we limit ourselves to voluntary exchanges. Well, of course, the women don't want that, because they don't want a voluntary. They just want the maximum extraction at the minimum cost, at the least responsibility, and because the women are naturally predisposed to minimum adaptivity, right? Minimum adaptivity to the world, even if they're best at maximizing adaptivity to one another. Anyway. It's just physics. All I'm talking about is physics, and the difference in physics and human behavior is just our ability to choose what we mate with. All right. Is there anything else I want to cover? I did have a couple of topics to close with before I get into the. These are related. Before I get into the questions and Q&A, Kurt, is Dugan right about religious awakenings? No. There are no religious awakenings. There are only reformations. American church, street, what do you call it? Strip mall fundamentalism is a reformation of institutional religion. Protestantism, reformation of Catholicism. Catholicism, reformation of Orthodoxy. Blah 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 blah. So I mean, these are reformations of Judaism. Islam is a reformation of Christianity. Buddhism is a reformation of Hinduism. Hinduism is a reformation of Proto-European religion. Germanic religions are a derivation of Proto-European religion. Western religions differ, and because the people who came from the Europe in other words, the people who came from Europe, from that, or which civilization, into the steppe, were already Europeanized, but they developed the steppe political structure there, and those people tended to go into Greece. The next people up tended to move into the Etals in the south, and then the Germanics and the Balto-Slavs and the Slavic stayed in place. So, I mean, we see these religions are all come from the same force, which is the same thing. The only thing that's weird is the more we learn about Scandinavian religion, the more it looks like it's a unification or an intersection between the hunter-gatherers who are already boat builders and the mixed agrarians and steppe herders that were coming back in. So there's something weird there, but which is very interesting. Anyway, So Christianity failed to reform in response to empiricism and Darwin. We had no Augustine, who was in the 400s, no Aquinas in the 1200s, so nobody showed up in the 1800s. And honestly, that I feel like my work is much more interesting along that lines, because religion is actually very interesting, and sciencing, Christianity and European religions together and understanding how it solved the trifunctional problem is actually really fascinating. Um, in retrospect, we can see the Catholics pretty much got it right by trying to unite Jerusalem and Athens. But that they got the philosophical structure right, and they would have ended up with just pure natural law like the English did. The church didn't go there for reasons of simple economics and power and malinvestment. The Orthodox, but what the Orthodox didn't go that direction, which is unfortunate. But it's fortunate because Orthodoxy didn't compete with the state, try to produce an opposition to the state, instead went with the state and maintained national. So the Orthodox Church is didn't have to get into all this lying, cheating, and scheming. They just maintain the tradition. So I'm like, well, if you want to be Christian, go with orthodoxy because it doesn't have all this baggage. If you want to be secular humanist, well, it's just the Catholic Church was right. So they just didn't reform, and secular humanism needed to understand it was just natural law and the science of Christian and understand this sciencing was Christianity was trying to achieve as cooperation under trifunctionalism between the classes. So the Germans unfortunately got defeated by Napoleon, and the end of the monarchy was sort of the end of European civilization, because the monarchies, as opposed to the church, and remember the monarchy and the nobility, the monarchy created incentive for the nobility to imitate them, just like the middle class nobility created an incentive for the middle class to imitate them, just as the middle class created a incentive for the peasantry to imitate them. But when you broke that chain, you got this crap we have now, which is this hyper humanism. And instead of excellence, driving everybody to excellence, which was the high arts of Germanic civilization, the second Germanic, Germans, a scientific and industrial revolution, in other words, the movement of the scientific, academic, and industrial revolution to Germany, and the German attempt to restore our ancient religion and culture, which we saw maximized in the Prussians and the Prussianization of Germany, and our perfect government, which was established again, made under the Germans in Germany. That was all destroyed by the loss of the monarchy, and unfortunately, because the Germans were defeated by Napoleon, and who was really just bringing about Catholic Church dominance, like the popes. The popes had failed to conquer. The Napoleon succeeded where the popes had not, and so they created a market for. They took away the market for masculine, innovative, adversarial, hyperadaptive excellence, and began the trend downward, which we see in feminism today, or the destruction of Western civilization today, as all this debauchery. And I'm not really so problem by debauchery. What I mean is the lionization of defect. And so this is really the natural female tendency, right? Her children are good no matter what, whereas for the aristocracy, the best is good, is best no matter what. And so that happened. And so the so once we lost the monarchies, we sort of lost Europe, and we were reduced to feminine caretaking as the last means of political decidability, rather than adversarial excellence as the last means of decidability. And one world government is just an extension of the female strategy of eliminating the ability to organize capital and prohibiting the development of excellences, which would produce alpha males, which would produce competition between alpha males, which would continue evolutionary adaptation. And the last thing I want to cover is no, I'm not going to cover that. I'm going to stay on subject. That's all I'm going to do today. So I'm going to go over and into the Q&A now. As I saw last time, I didn't feel good about starting Q&A at the beginning. I prefer to save them before the end. That way, it's most likely that the questions that end up in the here in the stream end up being related to whatever I'm talking about. So I'm going to work on them. Kurt's sound is working great. You guys are laughing at each other. I can't follow any of this. Mutual insurance of individual sovereignty can be used to justify female sovereignty unborn viable. Well, no. Again, abortion is murder. Yet we murder people all the time. We murder them in war. We murder them in street justice, courtrooms. We murder them in street justice. We murder them in intersexual competition and rage, right? We murder people all the time. So there's nothing special about women murdering their children. Women have murdered more of their children than men have killed each other in war. We have lots of evidence of this. It's everywhere. And we can't even separate. We can't even tell. In other words, there's huge vast numbers of childhood skeletons in where children have been, especially in urban civilizations, where women have murdered, way more children than men died in war. We don't really know how many died of exposure or that ever, because those were not always buried in cemeteries. But if you take out the fact that we don't know how many children actually died of disease and how many of their mothers killed them to reduce the number of their offspring. We don't know any of that stuff. We know it all happened. So women killing their offspring is whatever. So there's the argument that you're killing a person is simply true. In other words, a fetus is simply true. The argument of whether you want to be economically responsible for that person, simply ask it in those terms. You want to be mentally, emotionally, physically, economically, socially, and politically responsible for that offspring. Well, I mean, it's cost evasion. And so now women don't want to ever, women at all times want to go with their feelings, and they want to develop the least agency possible, the least responsibility possible. And so they won't take they only take on responsibilities that don't subject them to social shame and exclusion. So is it always, so this is, and how do I say this? It's a legally undecidable proposition. It's killing, it's murder, but is it a punishable murder? Is it or is it a murder we endorse? Well, I mean, there are reasons for doing all sorts of things. And I can't really make a legal decision about it other than it's a political decision. In other words, if the poly decides that that's the case, fine. You're going to have abortions. You're going to have less control of male and female sexuality, which is going to lead to more female and male experimentation, which is going to lead to more opportunity pursuit, which is going to lead to more exhaustion of periods of intersexual adaptation, which is going to lead to less constructive families, which is going to lead to more divorces, which is going to lead to more poverty, which is going to lead to more single mothers with children, which is going to lead to more impoverished men, which is going to lead to demands for redistribution out of moral hazard, which is going to lead for government authoritarianism, which is going to justify the recreation of an authoritarian state. In other words, it's like this is another example of the broken window problem. In other words, the reason you ticket people for jaywalking isn't because you want to prevent jaywalking. It's because you want to exhaust every single possible opportunity for people developing a habit or intuition that they can violate a commons. I don't have a personal stand on this. I'm just going to say that's the science. The science is it's going to produce those consequences. Those consequences, in my opinion, are bad. My feeling is that we have abandoned training the human beast into those behaviors and intuitions necessary for the production of a high trust society capable of the creation and preservation of intergenerational capital and wealth and the means and the condition of prosperity and safety that results from that continuation and capitalization. All right, so that's just a fact. That's science. That's what's going to happen. You choose. My view is twofold. One, yeah, we should return to creating mindfulness, educations and manners, ethics, morals, friendships, mating, marriage. That should be part of education because we've lost the tradition now. So we have to reproduce it. You should learn contract and law and economic and all these basic things to be human. And the only reason the sciences matter is if you're going to go out and get a job in them. And otherwise, that's what's important to you is the science of human cooperation, human reproduction, human getting along, human reproduction, human life. That's the purpose of education. Now, we used to have it as the church did that. And then the state only got you into careers. That's why you learned reading and writing and arithmetic, so you could be employed. And that's the reason for the academy, is so that we could produce people who would help administer the state. But but without the church and the academy taking over, the academy is fucking evil. It's the devil incarnate, so to speak. It's the process of warfare against our civil. I mean, the academy has to be purged now, and so we have to create something. Well, you want to call it church, but basically something that trains the family, something that trains you for a career, and something that trains you administration of the state, which is law and economics and medicine. That's really all there is. The law, economics, medicine, and more. I mean, those are the four dimensions. Everything else is just life. And if you know basic law, accounting law, basic contract law, how the law of human behavior, basic law, which is the expression of human behavior, basic accounting, basic economics, and basic project management. The rest is just those are the universal rules for human cooperation. The rest of it is, do you know how to be to hygiene, manners, hygiene, dress, manners, ethics, morals? Do you know what those are? Do you know that they're just science? They're nothing else. Do you know that how to produce friends? Do you know how to produce a mating cycle? Do you know how to hold together a marriage? Do you know how to have children? And then how do you manage people? Because managing people is just like managing children, except that you can't lie to them as easy. So it's just the production of incentives. So those are the sort of three the necessary bits. Would take reading, writing, grammar, and arithmetic, and reading, writing, grammar, arithmetic, and of course logic you're going to get from law. You're sort of there. That's what you need to teach people, and we don't. We teach them the lies, the false promises. We do that in order to legitimize the state, and if we get it over to the church will just try to legitimize this. That what we want to legitimize is the fucking truth, because the truth is what forces us into cooperation. Equality and proportion. I don't know what that means. Kurt, your thoughts on a dowry system? I like the dowry system because I like those kind. In other words, I would rather be a parental warranty of participation in child rearing. In other words, your parents are saying that they will take on the responsibility of the economic and familial sustainability of your marriage. And just like I'd like to have it be that your retirement is a product of the productivity of your children, and that you're liable for the behavior of your children. If we restore those three things, we restore the responsibility to the family that exists in the company, where the responsibility of the company is a derivation of what exists in the family. I think it's pretty easy. These don't say anything except you can stop lying, cheating, and stealing. But once you've given people the freedom to industrialize lying, cheating, and stealing under the false promise that you're going to evade natural selection, you start that big freaking lie out there, and it's like, God loves me. No. I should act like God loves me. Uh, I don't think birth control was that big a deal. I think birth control was a contributing factor, but um, my experience with birth control is I'm disciplined enough to use a condom always. I have to because I'm a one-shot wonder. I mean, if I mistake once, she's pregnant, because that's all it's ever taken me. Uh, 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 and that I don't like what the pill does to women's behavior. Um, I wish we could reduce. I don't know. There's some relationship between female fitness and the and menses. So in other words, the pain she goes through. And so I would rather see us turn very women maximize the athleticism of our people, restore walking and all this other stuff by getting away from car society, etc. I'd rather see that happen, and then find some solution that reduces the discomfort. But the pill appears to have extraordinarily bad consequences, especially for intersexual relations. All this is true, Kurt. Thank you. King Kurt is going off. Yeah, like so he says. I sort of. Brad helped me a lot. I'm just more comfortable ad libbing than I was. I'm talking to you now like I talk as when I was CEO, and I had a very hard time converting from CEO to thinker, philosopher, and that I just didn't know how to simplify it. And you really need to thank Dr. Brad in helping me. He provided what I needed, which was somebody to talk to, and I could turn it into normie speak. I don't I think I'm ready for going on other channels. I think it's hard for me to go on other channels until I've published or at least produced a bigger body of more of this, and and maybe had somebody take this work and put it pull it into Final Cut or what's the Adobe equivalent of it, and add the proper nonsense around it. And the reason is that um, I between my July catastrophe with John and last year, and the hate that I got out of that, and between the fact that in order to I use this adversarial method. I use scientific method, right? I use adversarial prosecution, and I use King of the Hill games, and that gets me truthful responses up. In other words, that's what the internet has done and social media has done, is allow you to conduct real life experiences on people at very low cost. I mean, hard if you're a researcher in a university and you want to run an experiment, you try to get volunteers, and that's almost freaking impossible. But for what I do, social, scientific, psychological experiment, political experiment, just means I produce some freaking argument that agitates people from one side or the other or both, and I just basically walk through the argument until I've exhausted my understanding of both sides' positions. I just do this 12 or 15 times until I say, okay, I've discovered all the first principles. I can't find any variation in the use of these basic strategies and tactics, and therefore I'm exhausted. But this produces this thing of me like agitating against a whole bunch of people. So I've made all these people pissed. So between the very difficult problem of understanding what I'm saying, making a whole bunch of people pissed, and the John and I going out there trying to seize the one window of opportunity that was left before all this suppression happened, which was obviously planned. I mean, I just think it is hard to go on other people's shows. I'm happy to. On the other hand, I have to find someone who's intellectually capable. I mean, it's not like freaking, Molyneux is going to be able to do it. Who's going to do it? If you want me to just talk like this, in other words, discuss a subject, and the guy's going to interview me because he's going to ask me to recite the same stuff over again, well, that's probably okay. But most of the time, people aren't very good. I mean, they're not. Where the guys out there just aren't. I mean, who's good? I mean, who do I consider really good? I mean, you know, I'm too much of a, because I've addressed the female method and the Ashkenazi weaponization of it. I come out as anti-Semitic, where I'm just anti-Abrahamic, right? I'm not against anybody. I've talked about eugenics, which is the only solution to the problem, right? Which is, I don't mean like eugenics like putting people in camps. I mean eugenics like not paying people to have children. People know cancer get children and not rewarding them for it, and certainly voluntary sterilization and some for people who are cognitively incompetent, involuntary sterilization. I certainly believe in criminal sterilization. So I mean, these things are all just normal things that I would say. These are just scientific statements. The difference between science and politics is what you do, right? I think the truth. What you do is up to you, right? But the thing on my job is to prevent the lies. So, you know, who do I respect? James Lindsay at New Discourses. He's doing the philosophical version of my scientific version, so I'm an advocate of his. You know, I can name a couple of other guys. I mean, I do what if alt hist because he is one of the only young guys who has flipped the bit with enough autism, enough disagreeableness, and enough reading to be able to get to where he can most of the time talk about, he won't go all the way, but most of the time he can give a pretty accurate view of history. I can talk about what's his name that does the guy from over there, Azerbi. Caspian Report, who does global statistics. In other words, he gives up the geostrategy of different places. I can talk about Peter Zeihan, who tends to have the most accurate read of the near term, right? The medium term. I can talk about Peterson as being the interesting, you know, if kind of busted now, literary view of this, the psychological view of it. You know, he's kind of weird. He's got a weird mix, which I understand, but I can talk to him. I could talk to Eric Weinstein, but I mean, he'd avoid me like the plague. But I could talk to him about mathematics and the problems in economics. I could talk to, but I could maybe talk to Josh Blackman about the law. Might take me a few times to get there, but there's just, in other words, the people that are on, like, for example, I can talk to Garrity JF, right? Why? Because we're freaking related, right? I mean, my mother's family, we're like it's like 6 degrees of separation from, right? When I look at him and I listen to him, I'm like, it's just another one of my people, right? And because I love the guy, right? I mean, but you know, we would still come out on very different sides because he's taking a different. I mean, we don't disagree on anything except that I'm trying to produce law that limits the stuff, and he's trying to prevent that. And you know, but I would him. So, but I would talk to. I mean, JF's the kind of guy I want to hang with, right? I mean, I just love the guy. I mean, I could bullshit with him all day endlessly. You know, the guys on the hard right that have sort of disappeared from my universe. I mean, Sven and Mike I love them, right? But I mean, there's no value for me in going that direction because all it does is poison my ability to reach out. So I don't know who to talk to that would be able to conduct this. If you think that there's anybody out there that would benefit from it, fine. But, you know, there's a mistake here. And the mistake is that I'm talking to you in a social media format. And the educated people think I'm like Hoppe and Rothbard or some Rand or some other, or Molyneux or whatever, and I'm not. I'm a scientist. I'm just addressing the problem, and I'm just showing you you're right. And so it sounds like I I'm going to use the same kind of language, vocabulary, and goals of emotional and psychological and spiritual justification that, say, Michael Jones would, right? But I'm not that kind of person. I'm your typical. I'm, I'm like I'm not even like Hayek. Hayek is still, a philosopher of these systems. But I'm really I'm a formal logician of the sciences of decidability. I mean, it's just, the difference is that once you realize that that law is the broadest scope of decidability over any statement's truth, then because it doesn't have anything it excludes. It excludes only preference. You realize law is truth, philosophy is choice, and theology is wisdom. History and theology are wisdom. That's it. And you realize that's all there is. But law and science are the same thing. Law is the end result of the pursuit of scientific investigation, which results in testimony that allows you to continuously recursively disambiguate the universe into first principles, which produce first principles that in the logics we would call axioms, and physics we would call laws, which then those laws are used to construct everything. And if it can't be constructed from those laws, first principles, then it can't be true. And so it's so the you may not just like we say in Austrian economics. You may not be able to discover every kind of everything that's true by construction first principles, because you can't think of every combination and every circumstance, but you can falsify anything that isn't true, because if it's not constructible by first principles, because there's always a way to get to Rome, right, if it's true. So if I've basically created the logic and the first principles of the universe, that means what's testifiable and how, and that's it. So I mean, I'm more like a mathematician or a logician of law, or philosopher. We call it a philosopher of science, or a scientist or social scientist, than I am a philosopher a producer of ideology, philosophy, or theology, or like the left does, a false promise, which is fraud. So they talk about they're producing thought and fraud, but the reason they don't talk about it in the scientific terms is so they can lie. So these are just false promises, which are just frauds. That's what the left does. It produces frauds because that's what women want to hear. So yes, I think it's time for propagation, because I think I can explain my thoughts in terms that are largely accessible to most people. And as you saw with my attack on my investigation of the manosphere, I've solved so much of the problem that it doesn't matter what I look at. They all turn out to be easy. Just like the founding fathers of America were Freemasons belonging to a fraternity. Would a fraternity? Yes. And I think Brian is thinking that way. I don't know who else is on that. I know that Brandon has some ideas. I had originally thought of it as a judicial, but I'm thinking more that, there's this, I hate to use this example because people fuck with it. But I mean, you look at the Hospitaliers and the Templars, and you see that those were a combination of martial and political orders, and with a internal contract. And I would like to see us produce something of that nature. My original intuition, if you've read Dune, I mean, the movie's out there, so that's why I'm going to refer to it, is the Mentats get a seal, a tattoo, basically. A Mentat gets a tattoo that he's uncorruptible. Is it Mentats? Or is it doctors? Anyway, somebody in there gets a seal. One of the groups gets a seal. That seal is they're uncorruptible. I think it's a diamond in the forehead or something, a diamond shape in the forehead. I kind of like the idea that if you can sort of pass this verbal interrogatory at some level, you get some rank. And that we would be seeking to produce the ability to make arguments, not like a PhD in cross-examination, but the ability to handle some, and you would move up through the ranks by your ability to judge. And I think that kind of fraternity, that would be the equivalent of that. And then there would be the reward rituals among the men who would do it. I would think that would be good if we combined it with some sort of martial fitness. The question is, can we combine it with housing, dormitories? Because that's what really makes it successful. And so that with the dormitory thing, in other words, the kind of thing you had with the Roman cults was you just got a place, a secret place. But they cost money, and most of our guys are poor. They're underpaid. The next level up is if you can get a building, and the third level up is you can get a dormitory. So if you get a dormitory or a college, right, where you are combining your living, you're getting almost no living expenses, very shared food expenses, and you're being militarily worked out every day. And you're being trained every day, and you're basically trying to find productive employment part-time, right? Then I think that might be a very interesting way to look at it, because of course I'm just looking at what's worked elsewhere in the past. This works, but if you can find a way for that to produce what the guys are recommending is the security service, then you've got essentially a modern recreation of the Templars, the Hospitallers, and whatever, or the ancient monastery. And I think this is I think this is a direction that would be interesting. So there's sort of that monastic business or the academic business route that are both available, or the pure fraternity route. And I think those routes are available. I know that institutional framework is critical. I just haven't gotten far enough where I can focus on it yet. All right, is there anything else here? Founding America. You're never going to get a parallel society. Never going to happen. It's another libertarian dream. It's like the Jews on their little, communist outposts. Never going to happen. Okay, I think that's it. Any other questions? Please, I'll give you a few seconds to ask. Yes, thank you for those of you who are saying thanks in here. Good luck. I've been on for 11:30. Oh, 12:30, 1:32. I've been on for my 2 hours, so I've used my 2 hours. And I hope you enjoyed it. If there's any other questions, I'll wait a few seconds. Otherwise, I think 2 hours of rant is probably enough. Anyway, I want you to notice my cup, my Proprietarian Institute cup. It may be cold, but because it's in a Proprietarian Institute cup, it warms my heart. All right, guys, love you all. Thanks for all the thumbs up. Thanks for all the stuff. Please comment on the videos, because it helps us. It helps us grow. All right, love you all. Again, thanks for sharing the journey. God bless you all. Take care.